So, good morning, afternoon, and evening to our global audience. Welcome to this landmark moment, which is the official launch of the African AI Equality Toolbox and its webinar series. So, today marks the culmination of really extensive collaborative work between Women at the Table, the African Center for Technology Studies, ACTS, and numerous dedicated partners who have made this groundbreaking toolbox possible. And we're here to celebrate not just a launch, but a movement toward more equitable and right-centered AI development across Africa. So I'm really thrilled to introduce our distinguished speakers, Winston Ojenge and Caitlin Kraft-Buckman, who are really the architects behind this African AI Equality Toolbox. And they will share invaluable insights into the toolbox development journey, its transformative purpose, and how it's positioned to really help reshape African AI innovation with human rights at its core. Winston Ojenge is Principal Research Fellow and Head of ACTS AI Institute at the African Center for Technology Studies, ACTS, an intergovernmental think tank that develops science, technology, and innovation policy for African governments. He's the founder of the Lab for Ethics, Policy, and Scaling of AI, LIPSA, at the center. He also lectures AI and robotics at the Technical University of Kenya. Caitlin Kraft-Buckman leads the AI and Equality Human Rights Initiative through Women at the Table, which is a pioneering feminist systems change organization that's really been at the forefront of addressing gender and technology intersections with big and growing expertise in digital public infrastructure. So welcome, Caitlin and Winston. We're really honored to have you with us today and to hear from you. So before really diving into a conversation with you, I think it's really important to kind of speak about what makes the toolbox revolutionary. So the African AI Equality Toolbox introduces a comprehensive human rights-based AI lifecycle framework, which seamlessly integrates critical reflective questions and human rights impact throughout every stages of AI development, from initial design concepts and data collection through deployments, monitoring, and beyond. And this launch webinar is your gateway to a comprehensive 6-part series that will guide you through each stage of the AI lifecycle. So you'll find the complete schedule on both the Women at the Table and AI Equality websites, and I'll share the links in the chat shortly. And don't worry if you miss any sessions, all the recordings will be accessible on our YouTube channel for really continued learning and conversation. What's more exciting is that the toolbox will also sit on our AI Equality website and will be an interactive and living resource on our community space on Circle, where we host a growing global community of multidisciplinary researchers, curious and concerned with different perspectives necessary to help invent the solutions we need for the tech, for future tech. So without further ado, let's dive in and explore how this toolbox is set to transform the landscape of human rights-based AI development in Africa and beyond. And I've prepared a set of questions, and I'd love to start with you, Winston, because really, yes, really starting from the big picture. If you could please tell us what inspired the creation of an Africa-specific and reframed AI Equality Toolbox, and why was it essential to center a human rights-based, feminist, and decolonial approach to AI, specifically within the African context? If you could tell us what makes this African-centered approach so critical for the continent's AI future.
Thank you very much, Amina. It's a complex question, but I believe that this is not the first toolbox of ethics of AI. There've been others, but what makes this one particularly different is the fact that it's trying to embrace the African culture. It's made a good attempt. You know, Africa is largely untouched by technology because majority of Africans, I would say 60%, are within rural spaces that are not extremely accessible by technology. And these are people whose every little action is closely entwined with culture. Culture means a lot to them. That is how they've always done things. So when technology embraces their cultures, they identify with it more. There's a lot of human rights which is camouflaged within culture. And the toolbox is simply trying to, to sensitize the AI developer on some measures that they need to take care of or observe in the process of AI development. When they interact with the user communities, then they need to respect culture. They'll get you often more, they'll they'll be able to get access to the data and get access to the cooperation of communities from whom the data is coming. I'll give you an example. There are so many communities that are involved in farming, but the women do the farming, and yet the women are not supposed to interact with the AI developer who will mostly be male. You see, the person who can traverse, inaccessible geographies to be able to reach communities and gather data is often the man, hardly the lady. And when they touch base with these farming communities they're not able to engage with the real farmer who is the woman. It's the husband who presents himself. Then you can see that data collection is not precise. So the toolbox is simply trying to sensitize the developer who's going out there to collect data, that there are certain things you need to do to embrace that culture. For instance, maybe include a woman in your team if you want precise data. So there's a myriad of sensitivities that we have put into this that are trying to, unlock the human rights which are hidden within culture. And that, I think, is what makes it probably different. Thank you.
Thank you so much about that and for telling us about the context-based kind of cultures that the toolbox looks into, and actually what it means in practical terms to move beyond these patriarchal mechanisms in AI development. Um, I guess I'm curious about the framework, and I want to ask Caitlin to tell us more about it. So the toolbox is built around the human rights-based AI lifecycle framework, which actually has been validated by the CEFI, European Society for Engineering Education, and which has been taught across Europe, Latin America, and Africa extensively. Caitlin, can you walk us through how this approach evolved and how it's structured across different stages, and what actually makes this lifecycle framework particularly powerful for ensuring right-centered AI development?
Oh, thank you for that. It comes from, we started off actually working with a technical university in Switzerland, EPFL, because we wanted to impact a generation of data scientists. But in our journey, we realized that there was something more, was larger at stake. But we've sort of come full circle because now we're also trying to find the developers in Africa and also in Latin America with our other project. So we hit on a human rights-based approach because the ethical AI, the responsible AI, all these wonderful different names for AI, good meaning AI, AI for good, are all a little bit a la carte. We have more than 80, maybe 100 by now, guidelines from corporations, from governments, from academies, very fabulous guidelines, but they're all a bit different. So where was the commonality? So we wanted to go back to human rights. It's a settled body of law, international settled body of law that focuses not so much on process, but on impact on humans, and also increasingly now on the environment, humans and their environment. So we thought that this was a really fabulous framework to depart from. What we did then is we worked with a team of data scientists and machine learning specialists, and we broke down sort of the AI lifecycle and how rights can be impacted on each particular part. Because we found many developers, almost all developers, really wanted to do the right thing, but they're like saying, how? What does human rights mean? That seems very abstract, very liquid, but my AI, my machine learning and my data set are here. How do these two things interact? So we broke it down into 6 stages, which briefly are the objective. What are you making and who's it for? And why? And actually, even is AI the right solution? Because often it just seems like the kind of the cool solution, but it may be there might be very sort of older technologies that are more stable and a little easier to do. Who's on your team? Is it multidisciplinary? As it, besides for gender balance, we need to have women there, but we also need to have experts in gender. Just because you have women doesn't mean they're experts in gender. We need human rights specialists. We need sector experts. We need anthropologists, such as yourself, Amina. We need people who are social scientists who understand the living, breathing culture of these communities so that we can bring the solution closer to the people for the builders. Then we have technical requirements, these system requirements that this new team that you've found work on together. We have third, data discovery, because we know more and more, and we'll see probably as we speak, that the data sets that we have don't reflect the lived realities of the people for whom we're making the AI, then the model selection, then the model interpretation, and finally deployment, which is not the end of the cycle at all, but really a beginning of investigating how these AI systems live in the wild. So that, in a nutshell, is our sort of 6 stages of AI development.
Yeah, and it seems like it moves from abstraction to a step-by-step framework. And I think what's really exciting about the toolbox are the case studies that it brings together. So, Winston, I'm really curious about some of these. So, the toolbox explores the AI lifecycle through 5 strategic sectors via detailed African conceived solutions and innovation in case study from agriculture, health, climate, digital security, and education and language. I'm curious about what drove the decision to use this case study methodology and why were these particular sectors selected and how do they actually reflect the unique opportunities and challenges within the African AI landscape?
Okay. Thank you, Amina. The methodology of case studies is certainly a powerful one because um, people like to learn from the known toward the unknown, and developers are not really, varying from one another. Most of the developers are youthful Africans within Africa, and the the experiences are not really different from one to the next. And when they read, features of an AI solution that has been developed by another, they easily identify with it. And chances are that there's a lot of shared features that they will be identifying with. Um, it's also very likely that the challenges that a previous developer within the case study has gone through, the challenges he or she has faced, are likely the challenges that this particular person that we want, that is our audience of this toolbox, would also be facing. And then probably it makes it more effective. Yeah, about the fact that what was your second question? You put all 3 questions together.
Yes.
You're excellent. Mm,
Yeah, really just curious about how do they reflect the unique
mm.
opportunities and challenges
Oh,
within the African AI
okay.
landscape.
Yeah, I believe that the challenges, okay, those particular sectors that you addressed are not the entirety of sectors within Africa. They just happen to be the sectors that are shouldering maybe the bigger part of the African economy. And we thought that it would be wise to start with them. Of course, eventually we're going to try to touch base with the other sectors. And again, these are sectors that have drawn most attention of the AI developers. So a lot of AI developed in agriculture and at health. And so addressing this would probably be reaching a larger, developer audience. But suddenly we'll go into new ground when this stabilized.
Yeah, and perhaps we could even dive more into the case studies or these sectors. If perhaps you could give us a look at the health and agriculture case studies, perhaps what specific insights emerged, how do they demonstrate the toolbox practical application, and particularly the scope of African innovation.
Um, there's something that is coming out very clearly through these case studies. And then number one, and that is very African, the data is extremely difficult to get, to obtain. In Africa, data fast is costly because you have to traverse, geographies to be able to touch base with communities, and sometimes the logistics are not extremely friendly. So data becomes very costly. But also the art of collecting data is not easy. Remember that most of the developers are youthful people who are good in the technical. They happen to be good in programming, etc. Yet data collection is a very social thing. You have to engage with communities, you have to be socially fluent to be able to extract, exactly what you need from them. So I would therefore say that data is a big issue for most of the developers. And that, like I say, it's a very African thing. And the developer therefore needs to be able to address how to collect data. Another thing which is extremely African too is the accessibility of this data from communities that are largely, maybe vernacular speaking, monolingual, and yet, AI is a very English. Okay, so I know the AI is struggling there are people who are developing it in French, etc., but it's a very English technology. So you're dealing with people who are monolingual, who can't understand you, the developer, and therefore you will have to have vernacular interfaces or vernacular speaking members of your team. You're also dealing with communities that are largely also illiterate. You have parts of Africa where illiteracy levels are as high as 70%, yet they need the power of AI to transform their lives, and you need therefore to collect data from them. So you can see those are challenges. Then another thing we also realized, particularly in health, is that the human must stay in the loop. The human must stay supervisory to AI. AI is not, a magic, a magic kind of tool. So if you leave all, decision making to machines, the risks are just too high. Maybe there are others, but those probably are top of my head.
No, those are really real challenges, and I guess moving from offline to online communities and working with data and meeting people where they are. And I guess I'm really curious about another case study, which is on technology facilitated gender-based violence. So very different from agriculture and health. And Caitlin, if you could tell us a little bit about that case study and what key lessons that or that case study reveals about the intersection of technology, security, and human rights, and what different lessons does it also bring to the life cycle approach?
Yeah, it's a really it flabbergasted me. I was really very moved and surprised by this case study, which comes from research from Code for Africa that they've done over the last 3 years in about, I think, 11 different countries, because it's the opposite end of the other case studies that we collected. The other case studies, which I will get into after this TFGBV one. The other case studies are really about solving a problem that's really deep, really African, really kind of explosive if they solve it, and also could be replicated in not only other countries, but all other regions. It makes, for me, Africa super relevant and global. The TFGBV one is like everything bad, everything that's gone wrong, right? And so it's the opposite end of this like innovative solutions. But at the core, there are a lot of things at the core of it. One of which also connects to what Winston just said, which is language. So even if we're going to assume that the platforms have done their very, very best in content moderation and in building, which is a big if, but let's put it there, and really want to solve the problems, what they don't know, what the machines don't know, what the machine learning, what the machine has not learned is the vernacular. They don't know the local languages. And so by not knowing their local languages, they cannot spot when there's inflammatory language that's going to destabilize a political environment or is going to go after a woman who's stepped out of line, quote unquote, or a journalist or a politician. Because the platforms reward they reward engagement. And so sort of also the worse it is, the more it gets engaged, but the platform doesn't understand that that's why it's being engaged with. Also, the people who are perpetrating these things, which are really our crimes, are become more and more sophisticated. So they're learning the platform doesn't understand Igbo or it doesn't understand Kiswahili. And if we change 2 or 3 consonants, 2 or 3 letters around, or we use a slang word, right? It's only trained on words, very academic words. It's like people learn French in school. It's not the French that's really spoken in the streets in Paris or Marseille or in Kinshasa or in Goma, right? That's a different French. But if you're only learning the French of the 17th and 18th century, as the machines have been taught, you don't understand how it's being transposed. So that's part of this TFGBV thing, which is quite a scourge. And we'll do a whole separate webinar on it, including the entire the sexploitation that's happening, which is really it's racketeering, right? It's not individual actors, it's criminal networks being engaged. On the other side of it, as it happens, another Code for Africa case study from their censors group has to do with their journalist network, which is where they come from, and wanting to have open data about pollution in cities. And they're learned a very important lesson, again, to many of Winston's points about community engagement, because they wanted to put sensors. They have the sensor methodology. They have an incredible technology, which we case study. But the people in the informal settlements were not interested in having sensors placed in their houses if they didn't know where. They didn't want to be surveilled. So it was really critical to understand what the people wanted, why they wanted it, what problem they wanted to be solved, and how to engage with them so that value was brought to the table. And that's really interesting for me. We look at that as climate change study in the toolbox, both from a urban environment, because we know asthma's on the rise. We know that the largest cities in the world have yet to be built, and they will be in Africa. These sort of exploding population urban environments that are going to have lots and lots of environmental problems, as all emerging cities do, and also for rural environments in that sensor thing. So those are sort of 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. Of one is technology being used to sort of get ahead of the harms that are going to happen and using these sensors in a really interesting way, and also technology creating harms, and how do we deconstruct that and name it and deal with it, as 2 case studies out of the 6.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have many follow-up questions, and it's really exciting to know that the series will dive into each of these case studies at length. And I also want to invite everyone with us here. If you have any questions, we'll try and get to them at the end of this conversation. So please send them through the chat in the meantime. But to stay in the question of language conversation that both Winston and you, Caitlin, brought up, and hopping back to the challenge of AI's monolingualism in Africa. The question of education is particularly interesting and relevant given Africa's linguistic diversity. Winston, can you please tell us, what do these case studies teach us, perhaps not only about preserving cultural identity, but also the incredible wealth of data and invention that can advance AI innovation, which is not only for Africa, taking Africa to the world and making it as a point of reference?
Okay, I know AI in health is extremely powerful. It's a lifesaver. AI in agriculture, optimizes food production. But I've always believed deeply that AI in education is probably the game changer. Why? Because that's the factory of new humans, new generations. And if it's done well, you really are investing heavily in the next generation. There is something very unique about, again, Africa. For instance, today, a child growing up in Canada or the United Kingdom would usually have English as the first language. But in Africa, it's very different. Children walk out of home at 6 years and go to school speaking vernacular only. And we are talking about probably 65% of children that are in the rural. So if you want to use is literacy, is the ability, is the learning of read, write. And it's usually a big challenge in Africa because now the child has walked in speaking vernacular. So you have to teacher, you have to engage this child in vernacular, but there has to be a point of transition as you move the child progressively toward English language it is. Now that transition is usually very tough, it's extended, and if there are ways of accelerating it, there's always knowledge which is lost during the transition. And AI is really attempting, is really a big promise in this. But you need to engage the vernacular languages. And the vernacular languages, for AI, it means that it starts by learning natural language as foundational. Before then, you bring in now the particular languages for it to learn. So that has been a challenge. And it's something that would, if we were to crack it, would certainly be a game changer. We are telling the developer, fixing the developer to focus on this as one of the most, game-changing abilities or solutions.
And to stay within, sorry, Caitlin, you wanted to say something. Yeah, I guess to stay within this question of scale and making, things happen faster, I guess AI is often connotated with scale and speed, and a present reality in many African AI deployments is also this pressure of scale, which is often at the expense of careful consideration. How does the toolbox and how do the study cases kind of navigate this tension between achieving equity but also meeting replicability and scalability demands?
Is that for me?
For both of you, but we could start with Winston and yeah, move to you, Caitlin.
There's been conventionally developed, at least from the developer's point of view, is that ethics fight scaling. That ethics is regulatory and it stifles innovation and therefore it stifles scaling. We now believe very strongly that nothing can be further from the truth. There's a lot of evidence that is emerging that ethics actually complements scaling. So if you are responsible in your AI development, it is very likely that your AI will deploy successfully. Let's look at one of the largest principles, one of the most prominent principles of ethics of AI, according to UNESCO, STEM, and that is bias and inclusivity or exclusivity. If you exclude a big population, let's say you wanted to do crop development, you wanted to do yield predictive model develop for, say, a set of 5,000 farmers in a certain district. You may not be able to touch base with 5,000 farmers as you define their problem, as you collect data from them. You probably would touch base practically with about 300. But these 300 need to be as representative as possible of the 5,000. So the science of sampling, of making representation be as ideal as possible is very social. And again, I need to point out that it's often beyond the youthful developer. If you did this wrong, your solution is really supposed to go back to serve the 5,000. So if you excluded a big part of the 5,000 and their data, who is going to take up, who is going to adapt your solution? So you need to be as inclusive as possible. And that is a very powerful ethics of AI principle. But you can see it's also a very powerful principle for scaling. Because if you want to scale, be inclusive, because the same people that you include are the ones who are going to use your AI solution. The two have a perfect nexus, scaling and ethics, and there's no conflict between them. And that is something that this particular toolbox is trying to spotlight and amplify, that keep to ethics, developers, and then you will have success in scaling. And that is the language developers really know, scaling.
Yeah. I would agree with you, Winston, that there's also this uptake, right? We've seen a lot over the past couple of years because we've been working together now a couple of years. And we see that people developed all sorts of algorithms that worked very well, like sort of in their PhD projects, their master's projects, but they didn't, they're just sitting there lying fallow because they never talked to anybody in the field and they never gathered new data. And that you really need to have that connection with the people who are going to use it, what you've built, in order, obviously, for them to decide to take it up and to make it live, and then to add new data and to have this sort of fabulous virtuous cycle. It's also another thing sort of about small to large that I think is kind of interesting is how the NLP community in Africa has been doing really, really important work trying to figure out what's the sort of smallest viable language model that they could use in order to be able to add a local language. We know that our colleagues at Masahani and others are working on this. And I think that a lot of the technical work that was done on trying to figure out what a small language model looks like has been partially what has helped others in other parts of the world, like in DeepSeek, to see we don't need to have massive language models in order to function. We can also have very small ones that are actually very pinpointed, really work well for a sector, for medical work, for legal work, for another language. And so I think that's also really, I mean, for me, it's really interesting that you can be doing very specific work that's so local, it has massive global implications, which is what I think a lot of these case studies show. I mean, I'd like to bring up the health case study just to go back to it for a second, which our colleagues at McCary Health Clinic have done, where they understood that the malaria diagnostics weren't working for parts of rural Uganda where they are charged to work, and that they needed, part of the problem was technicians. So they wound up inventing a kind of a microscope that's an addition to a smartphone. So first of all, that's like a big hardware invention that's really super cool, could be used anywhere and will be, I'm sure. Then they went out to actually to the people and to gather the data, which they didn't have, and they didn't have the kind of data they didn't have, also didn't have to do with a very specific region. In this case, they needed for the sort of the way that the mosquito was working in that region, but also the different people, young, old, the infected, HIV people, very sensitive data collection issues. So they had to collect data in a very interesting, thoughtful, dare I say, feminist data collection way, but really, with real informed consent. And then they built a model around it. And now it's working. And now they also want to do more local language so that the patients can sort of from text to voice can also hear and understand in Luganda to actually understand what's going on and why they've been diagnosed a certain way. So it's got a whole fabulous loop from a problem solution and then the community helping the community. And also, they're going to go after TB next, tuberculosis. They're going to go after cervical cancer next. So these are all things that are going to require, after they've built the hardware and they have a way a model works, they're still going to need the new data and they're going to need to sort of put that into and fine tune it with the model that they use. But that's the kind of thing that they're going to be able to also export to the world at large, because it really is an innovation that comes out of nobody ever having thought about the communities where they're working. That's what I mean, from the local to the global. So I find that super, super exciting.
No, absolutely. And also taking into consideration people who are offline and how many of these technologies don't really need Wi-Fi in the case of the health case study. And I think what's particularly extraordinary about the toolbox, it's how it really centers participatory methods and stakeholder engagement as kind of a central element or a central philosophy. And I guess you've shared really great strategies and practices that really can ensure meaningful community engagement. I'm wondering if there are any other best practices that you'd like to highlight or share, which are related to participatory methods that you've kind of thought about during the toolbox development.
I don't know, maybe if Winston wants to tell this instead of me, please feel free to interrupt. I think one of the case studies that is also mind-blowing is the Kenyan Sign Language case study. So here's an NLP problem, which are these different Kenyan languages, but now even smaller subset of Kenyan Sign Language, where evidently there's no standard English sign language. There's either American or there's British, and then Kenyan Sign Language is different from Uganda Sign Language. Like, people have different signs for fish. So they had to do work from figuring out how the model vectors work for signing. They had to do data collection to really go for old signers, young people, girls instead of boys. Because mostly there are not as many girls in the schools for the deaf at a younger age. They had to go find them. They really, really worked very hard to have as robust a data set as possible. They had to solve these problems, like I said, about like how do the models work and how do you make it fluid. So and those learnings are things that I think that other groups in other, like Quechua in Latin America, the learning and the modality from the Kenyan Sign Language, you could understand what they've done, the really hard work, and then bring it over to your indigenous language and figure out, how to translate it. So I think that's really super powerful. I love that one. I think that's a great one. Sorry.
Yeah, I can't agree more with Caitlin, but I would like also to add this, that AI is in two main tiers. There's the foundational tier, which is developed out of very complex math, huge, massive compute that is only possible with big tech like Google, etc. And then you come and build applications on top of this foundation. You bring in data, which is contextual, and you load the data to those foundational mathematical models, and you build your own model, which is contextual. The foundational tier is still slightly beyond Africa, but I believe that Africa now should focus more intensely on the ability to build the applications that sit on top of the models. And just like, where China was 60 years back, India, probably about 50 years back, was developing simple tools that serve their people. So Africans need to develop simple applications, AI applications that serve their people, extremely contextual. Currently, because there's poor data collection by the developers, about only probably 10 to 20% of all the development effort is actually deployed. So the rest of the 80 sit on the shelf, they collect dust. Why? Because at trial, once the prototype is done at trial, it's found to be imprecise because data was collected poorly. So if that trend continues, then Africa is going to be, in a pretty bad place. So the youth, the developers, we need to crack this thing about data collection. Data is equal to AI, and data collection is extremely difficult. So problem definition and data collection are entwined together. We need to capacity strengthen the youth, the developers, as actively and as aggressively as possible, so that we can have AI which is developed and used and scaled properly. Innovators are incentivized. People find use for their local AI. Then it will be possible at one time to start building the foundational models. Otherwise, then the divide is going to grow bigger. Thank you.
Thank you both for that. I think you've really covered the grounds for my next question, which was really a project of future mapping, and really thinking about, as we look towards the future, how do you envision the toolbox influencing AI development practices, shaping innovation, policy frameworks, and transforming governance approaches across Africa? And I was really curious about how you think success looks like 5 years from now. And I think, Winston, you did touch on some of that already, which is really building contextual models, layers of development, and having simple applications. But please, if you have any more other kind of visions, but specifically linking how the toolbox can be used by people in the continent and abroad, and throughout the world, to shape a future that is dignified for everyone with AI tools.
So yes, Kathleen, go on, please.
I was going to let you finish because you're so really powerful on this. I was going to say that for me, in 5 years, starting in Africa, but the rest of the world as well, but here, because it's not only an Africa problem at all, but that the absolute first thing that a master student does, a PhD student, a kid sitting in her bedroom late at night, figuring out how to code and making an incredible application. Everybody in this process is going to be thinking about who are the people that I want to serve? What's the problem I want to solve? And have I met the people who have that problem? Do you know what I mean? Do I know those people? It's not, do I think? Do I think there's a problem that should be solved? But who are those people and what are different ways to look at it and then build the best thing? But to really start from that kind of humble and curious and engaged kind of thinking about, we want to build things that people use, that people need, that change their lives. And therefore we need to ask those people what they need and what their problems are. Yeah.
Very, very, very nicely put. And that makes my work very easy. I just piggyback on that. The toolbox, this particular toolbox is extremely heavy on the idea of interacting with the user community, so that you define the problem with the user community. Defining a problem is extremely difficult. I wish we had time that I would have, maybe there'll be an opportunity over an experience we had when we went to try to define a problem with small-scale farmers. And the problem they kept telling us that we need to crack for them was weather prediction, which was extremely difficult, but eventually we realized that we could use a different seed variety, not the kind that we're using. So that then weather prediction stopped being the issue. The issue now came to be early alert of disease infestation and pest infestation for new variety. So you can see therefore that defining a problem is a very social thing, and it's a constant interaction before you identify actually what the problem really is, which can be solved. And then now collect data around that problem. We need to, and this particular tool is really stressing this, that we need to focus on how to develop data with the users, so that then the data would develop quality solution, which then can be deployed, can be used extensively by people. Once you use this AI solution extensively in community, the opportunities of becoming better and refining your, development abilities, your machine learning and AI knowledge, it becomes much easier. And then Africa could try to bridge this gap as much as possible. Okay.
Thank you so much. This is a really inspiring conversation, and I wish we had longer than 1 hour to speak further. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. And again, I think this was kind of a teaser to what's coming for the upcoming webinars. So the link is on the chat. Please join us next Monday, Monday 15th. We'll explore stage 1 of AI development of the toolbox, which is fundamentally a participatory and grounded approach, so really an extension of this conversation. And what is more exciting is that the toolbox will be published this month, so please stay on the loop, keep following on the socials to check it out, and on the websites as well. I want to thank Caitlin and I want to thank Winston as well for making time for this conversation today. And if you have any questions, I think now we can move to the Q&A.